Last week, in the second half of Viewpoints, we began covering Saudi Arabia's aggressive move into the sports industry and what's really behind this big power play. In just the last few years, the oil-rich Middle Eastern Gulf country has dropped billions of dollars to buy out existing teams, prominent players, and fund new leagues across several sports. Are you familiar with Live Golf? In 2021, the country spent $2 billion to create the standalone league, and since then has acquired some of the sport's greatest names to play exclusively under its roster. The league has grown to be so much of a headache for the American-led PGA Tour that earlier this spring it negotiated an agreement to eventually merge with Live Golf, and it doesn't end there. Saudi leaders have struck big deals to host major tennis championships, the Formula One Grand Prix, and several wrestling and mixed martial arts competitions. And don't forget about football, which we know as soccer here in the States.
Lots of investment in football, soccer, especially in the Saudi Pro League, where some very prominent global footballers have gone to play, male footballers have gone to play, and I'm thinking specifically here of Cristiano Ronaldo.
That's Simon Chadwick, a professor of sports and geopolitical economies at Schema Business School in France. As Chadwick mentioned last week, one person behind this big investment into sports is the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He rules over Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, which as of last month is estimated to hold $925 billion in assets. Essentially, this money exists to finance projects that will help grow and diversify the nation's economy. Leaders like Salman have been vocal about the need to invest in other ventures outside of oil and believe that a heavy presence in global sports will help move the country into a more modern and innovative age. The hope is that this in turn will help the government better connect with the country's predominantly Gen Z and millennial population. But at the end of the day, while Saudi has offered up many reasons for this expansion, there are still many critics in the West who believe that it's really all about trying to improve its tarnished reputation.
I guess the one thing that we very often hear is about sport washing and how Saudi Arabia is sport washing, which is essentially trying to cleanse its image, its reputation. We know, many of us, that Saudi Arabia has a particular reputation, and that is an outcome of several episodes over the last 20 years. And so I think brand Saudi Arabia is trying to change perceptions, is trying to change attitudes, is trying to get us to see the country in a different way.
But looking inward, is Saudi Arabia actually taking genuine steps to change its conservative culture and outdated practices?
So one of the things that I think many of us know is that historically there has been considerable inequality between males and females. For the first time in 2018, as many of your listeners may know, Saudi women were permitted to drive cars. There are now, across Saudi Arabia, female-only gyms, which before 2018, there weren't female-only gyms. And so, for those of us who believe that sport has the power to do good things to change societies, we could say that Saudi Arabia is a very interesting case study about how transformational sport can actually be. I guess the problem is just because a woman can go to a gym or just because a woman can go and watch a soccer game, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's real equality, true equality. So as the international community, I think it's incumbent upon us to continue to observe and to monitor and to comment on what's happening in Saudi Arabia.
Looking ahead, Saudi Arabia is hosting the 2034 FIFA World Cup and is also planning to submit a bid to host the 2036 Summer Olympics. Leading up to these two main stage events, Chadwick thinks Saudi leaders will pay special attention to avoid the fallout we've seen from past human rights mistakes, like those observed in Qatar leading up to the 2022 World Cup. But this also leads us to another question. Does the country really care about human rights, or just appearances?
What I think Saudi Arabia has learned from Qatar is that if it gets caught up in the same scandals, it will be potentially very damaging to the country. And I sense that the Saudi Arabians are determined not to make the same mistakes as the Qataris. In other words, they want to manage their communications much more effectively from the outset. It's interesting that they say they're not going to comment until an official bid has been made. And I think what we will also see potentially coming out of Saudi Arabia is they will be very careful to demonstrate that there have at least been some changes that have a positive impact upon labour markets in the country. What's going to be really interesting is whether Saudi Arabia chooses to go head to head and fight, or whether Saudi Arabia chooses to collaborate and effect the kind of positive transformations that many of us in the global north, I think, would expect.
At the same time, many long-standing organizations and sports watchers aren't happy about its swift takeover of certain sports. After all, the country has such deep pockets that in many cases, it's impossible for others to compete with these staggering bids. Chadwick says while there's not much that can be done about outbidding, the country's new endeavors will still face several challenges that money can't solve so easily.
The barriers to entry for Saudi spending in sports are existing TV contracts, existing teams, existing clubs, existing fan affiliations with teams. So what Saudi Arabia is doing, primarily through the Public Investment Fund, which is essentially the sovereign wealth of Saudi Arabia, is to invest in sports that have a global footprint, but which perhaps are commercially underdeveloped. So we see, for example, work in tennis. We hear that Saudi Arabia may be interested in investing in rugby and a little more in golf, in cricket. And so whilst I don't think that we should expect Saudi Arabia to gate crash I think for the time being, at least, we can't imagine Saudi Arabia buying an NBA franchise, for example. I think that would be too far too fast. But what we are seeing Saudi Arabia doing is working from the margins inwards.
We're still in the early stages of Saudi's headfirst dive into sports. Only time will tell if the plan ends in success or is an expensive blunder. To find out more about this topic and our guest, Simon Chadwick, head to viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written by our executive producer, Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Gary Price.
The Radio Health Journal podcast gives listeners the latest news on what's trending in health, science, technology, and more.
Why are certain providers and medical doctors not listening to family members who have lived through a disease path for such a long time?
Featuring medical experts who break down complex topics in a way that's easy to understand. Radio Health Journal podcast, available wherever you find your favorite podcasts and at radiohealthjournal.org.